There we go. Okay, that's a mouthful, and it's also not what's advertised. So I'll give you a few seconds to read all those words. As we discussed earlier today, keyword searches are very important in the modern scholarly forum, and so I tried to throw every keyword possible into my title as I was retitling this. This is actually a seminar that I gave here previously, and based on the things that have been going on the past few days that I've been able to attend, I think this fits much better. I was going to talk about fuzzy categories and categories and Aristotle, and it was a very nebulous talk, and I wanted to jump into something a little more concrete textually, and I also wanted to discuss how we can harness big data to do small things, to make small interpretive moves, or at least to find small loci in our text at which we can make those interpretive moves. And that's also a mouthful, so we'll go to the next slide and I'll start to explain piece by piece. Just brief introduction. I just finished my MA in English here. I'm finishing a bachelor's in computer science, and currently the decision is whether to stay in DH or to go into industry, because there are lots of pressures both ways. So, all right. Anybody recognize this? Gulliver's Travels? Jonathan Swift? Okay, so in the much maligned third section where we go to La Puta, right? I'll let you read into that what you will. There's this wonderful section which I think all digital humanists should know, and if you don't know it, please look it up soon. I'll just read. Everyone knew how laborious the usual method is of attaining to arts and sciences, whereas by the professor's contrivance, the most ignorant person may write books in philosophy, poetry, politics, law, mathematics, and theology without the least assistance from genius or study. He then led me to the frame. And this is a picture of the frame. I'm not so good with my Latin, but the surface was composed of several bits of wood covered on every square with all the words of their language, but without any order. Sound familiar yet? Bag of words. This is what we do when we process text, right? He assured me that he had made the strictest computation of the general proportion there is in books between the numbers of particles, nouns, and verbs, and other parts of speech. If you haven't read it, they proceed to shake this giant frame and get random strings of words and then write books with these random strings of words. They're permuting the language, which is what we do so often. And I always take this as a warning when I start getting too abstract from the text, when I start getting too mathematical with what I'm doing. So humanities computing, it's been going around a lot. This is the domain in which I'm doing my research, so I wanted to precisely define that domain. Being a computer scientist, that's what we do. We have to first talk about what we're computing over before we start talking about computing. So I define it, I guess this is synthetic meaning, right? We're taking the particles and we're taking the meaning of each and we're putting them together. Computation of, from, or over humanities artifacts. Today I'm going to take on literary texts, but first we should ground the work. So what are the domain and the range of humanities computing? We have several types. One is of, computation of, which means taking something and making a humanities artifact. This is generative art, right? This is permutations, random permutations sometimes of other literary works to make literary works. Anything where we take as input something that is not our humanistic artifact and we make a humanistic artifact out of it. Computation from humanities artifacts, so when we take a text and maybe we generate statistics. You could argue, I suppose, that statistics are humanities artifacts in and of themselves, and I think we saw by Ben, that demonstrated very well this morning. I had graphs, right, but beautiful graphs. I would have framed them and put them on my wall. This wonderful visual incorporation both of our interpretation of data, but also the uncertainty of the data at the same time, right? The bars ranging up and down from our fitting line. Beautiful stuff. And over, where we take humanities artifacts and we compute humanities artifacts. I would argue that most of our criticism in digital literary studies at least falls into this category, taking texts and making texts about texts. It's difficult to do though when you're generating statistics and graphs. So what I'd like to do is focus more on how you can use this sort of computation not to generate graphs, not to generate statistics, but to find certain passages in a work that might have interest to your research. Now, critical humanities computing. I would argue that this is what we do and that this is what we should be teaching. As a domain, it's so large that you could never begin to teach humanities computing in any sort of degree program, I suppose. But when we bring in the concept of choice, well, we start to think about what we're really doing. It's not unique that we're in this domain. Everybody who's a non-digital humanist is in the same domain. They just don't have computational power to do it. We create and we choose the algorithms we use. We choose the artifacts. We choose the results from that computation that we're going to deal with and not deal with. We choose when to inject ourselves into the computation based on all the critical theories, experiences, and personal dispositions we have. This is critical humanities computing, and this, I submit, is what we should be teaching. Now, within that, we have some tools. Natural language processing. There are many tools. The set of tools I'm going to be using today is called NLTK, which stands for Natural Language Toolkit. For those of you who hack Python, it's a Python framework for doing natural language processing. But my question is, when we're doing literary studies, are we dealing with natural language, and in what way are we dealing with natural language, right? How so? I'm sure I read this somewhere else, but you could call natural language the warp and the weft of what we're weaving when we write a literary text, right? So we're using the same material that I would use to, say, deliver an academic paper to you, but we're using it in a different way. So how does that affect how we use natural language processing? What I do is I pervert the tools to my own ends to figure out what in the text I want to find out, or to lead me to new things that I might not be able to find out about the text. So this requires hacking, to put it simply. I get into the code, I change these tools, and I see if anything more interesting comes out than, in the case of what I'm about to show you, parts of speech. So my project was to break open a part of speech tagger and see what I could get out besides words, tokens, and parts of speech. Good. So part of speech taggers are corpus trained tools, which, given a large corpus, this is where big data comes in, right? So it belongs in my title, where you take a large corpus that's tagged for part of speech, you count the coincidence of part of speech and particular token, word, and you also count sequences of parts of speech that are assigned to those words. So you're just calculating data based on a corpus. And then you use that data in order to tag a text that has not been tagged yet. So the idea is to take statistics over a large text, have a small example text, and infer, based on what you've calculated, what the parts of speech of each token are. Functional types. How many of you are programmers here? See a few. Good. So I'll take a second to explain this. The arrow is computation, NL is natural language, and the X means cross product. So what we're doing is we're taking natural language and we're computing it, and what we're getting out is natural language associated with parts of speech. More precisely, we're taking a list of tokens and what we get out is a list of tokens tupled with their part of speech. Wonderful tool for doing tagging, but tagging does not make a research paper, right? It's often a good hook for further processing of a text, but it's not something that we're able to publish, and more importantly to me, it's not critically interesting. In fact, it's very limited in its capacity and in its accuracy. So what I want to do is not to find definitive parts of speech tags, but rather to find syntactic ambiguity for critical purposes. I want to find the places in which a text threatens to break the normal grammatical order, threatens to break with syntax that we're used to, and see if those are interesting points to start an interpretation. And it's really pretty easy code-wise. You just have to dive in, see where the probabilities that are used to calculate parts of speech are generated. You have to memoize them, that is, you have to put them somewhere, and then you look through later and find the most improbable strings. So what I did is I took, this is simplified, this is pseudocode, but I took the part of NLTK that tags a text, and I modified it so that you pass in a number of passages that you want, how long those passages should be. In this case, it's what's called a 4-gram or a quadrigram. And then what you get out is the most ambiguous, according to this measurement, passages in the text. So we have here Faustus. I've been tweaking this algorithm a little bit and tweaking the way that I've trained the corpus. But what we get is a mixture of interesting passages and garbage, I would say, because the part of speech tagger is not completely accurate. I'm going to walk over. So this obviously brought him up so is not necessarily interesting. Maybe to you, maybe you can find something. And we've got self-conceit is waxen, also not an interesting passage. And these are very short snippets. But what we find highlighted here as the third ambiguous passage, whose sweet delight disputes. I'd like you to briefly read that entire period there. So excelling all whose sweet delight disputes in heavenly matters of theology. And I would ask you, who's doing the disputing? Sweet delight, good. So we have a collective sweet delight of all these people, which is doing disputing somehow, right? This is difficult to parse, but it's an interesting place to enter into the theme of disputation, which is very important in Faustus, right? He's able to argue himself out of just about any redemption that he would receive throughout the play, and by the end, indeed, he's no longer capable of receiving grace, right? So it's an interesting point of entry, but it's not in the way that statistics or a graph might be. It's not a total interpretation and abstraction away from the artifact. And this is what interests me about this sort of humanities computation, this sort of digital literary studies, is that we are immediately re-entrant into our text. And so the way I conceive of this kind of work is to cycle around and around, using the computer as a tool to find places. This is not human augmentation. This is substituting for my failings as a reader, right? I notice ambiguous passages when I have one sentence or maybe one verse. But as I read an entire narrative poem, when is my attention lapsing? When am I missing these places where you could enter into the text in interesting ways? In this case, it's a short text. It might not be the most interesting passage. In fact, I don't believe it is. We also have here, only this, gentlemen, we must now perform. The form of Faustus' fortunes, good or bad. And now to patient judgments we appeal. Right, this sort of meta theater that is going on, and that goes on throughout, because indeed in the source of Faustus we have a sort of, not chorus, it's not a chorus because it's not a drama, but we have this continuing commentary on the spiritual state of Faustus, which is sometimes at odds with the way the story is told. So there's this frame, and that's the most interesting passage here. So this is not going to find the most interesting passage in total, but what it's going to do is find these places where the text breaks, and sometimes those will be interesting places for us to enter into critical dialogue with it. So how can we abstract this then? This is the lightning talk portion, I guess, of my presentation. I want to know what other natural language processing tools, we can break apart in similar ways and get out different things, right? We have word sense disambiguation. All that you get out is kind of a complementary or non-complementary distribution of words that mean different things. How can we break apart this procedure to do interesting critical work, or to find places where we can do interesting critical work? Word similarity and topic modeling, a wonderful place, I think, that we can dive deeper or dive in a different way than natural language processing does into a text. Question answering even, right? Dialogue systems. It's been a pipe dream of artificial intelligence since the beginning of computing. How can we take question answering and make it more humanistic, make it more literary? So these are some of the things that I'm puzzling through right now in my own research. And by way of conclusion, and I hope I've left plenty of time for questions, I would like to jump to a different work from the same era, which I'm sure you all know as Hamlet, and from which my title comes. It's not the famous tagline, "The play is the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king," although this is important here. What I'm more interested in is having grounds more relative than this. When I read a text and I'm left with an impression as a reader, when I'm left with an impression as a scholar, but I don't know how to argue about what I've been left with, can I find tools? Can I write plays? Can I write programs that help me to find grounds more relative, that help me to find places in the text where I can enter in and figure out why it's having this effect on me? So with that, I will conclude. And are there any questions? It's easy.
What do you want to say any more about this dilemma of becoming continuing to work in digital humanities versus corporate?
I don't actually. I want to think it through first. It's a very difficult thing to think through, right? You invest yourself in schooling, and then all of a sudden you get to make a choice, and you all got to make this choice. So I'll ask your advice after the Q&A session, maybe. So, any other questions about the presentation? Yes.
I wondered, I noticed that the two false positives for ambivalent
Yes.
or unclear
Yeah.
passages in passages were both interrupted by a line break.
Yeah.
By punctuation. So is that something
It's-
you could code out by just saying ignore all of the?
What I've actually done is, the text that's presented up there is just a way of showing schematically where those things occur, but I've normalized the text before processing it, so it's processing its prose, right? Because this is what part-of-speech taggers work over. There's no, at least in any tag sets that I know for part-of-speech, there's no semantic element for the line break.
That's the point about like maybe not normalizing the data, that's
Yeah.
already an interpretation, because line endings in blank verbs like that
Absolutely.
have meaning.
Yeah.
You know? So
And there's-
you can't remove them without doing violence to.
And there's several more places where I would like to be able to compute over, I guess we could call them parameters, right? The interesting passage I showed you obviously was rich with alliteration, right? And the rhythm is broken in a very interesting way in the same passage. And so this is one aspect of a text. This is syntactic ambiguity. And this is it's an incipient research project, right? So what I'm trying to find is places like that, whether it's the line break, whether it's syntax, whether it's alliteration, whether it's rhythm. If you can figure out a way to really compute, Middle English, or sorry, not Middle English, but early modern English prosody over a passage, all of these things somehow, to us as readers and to us as scholars, combine to make a passage more impressive, more interesting. And so this is just one parameter, but I'm very much interested in computing over the line break. In fact, that's what my undergraduate work was on.
Yeah, I would hypothesize that you would have greater syntactic ambiguities over line breaks even when those are not end stops.
Or yeah, certainly, or there's at least a perceived one, right? Because you have, depending on the actor, depending on the point at which you're in the phrase, you also have a pause there quite often, right? A continuation of meaning past the line, which is not completed until you begin the next one. And it's sometimes we hallucinate about that as readers, I think, more than when you hear a first actor read it. Sometimes they'll read straight across, but there's the issue of reader versus listener as well. So more and more open-ended questions here, I know, but that's the fun. So.
But given that it's plain verse, there's a formal structure that it needs to end at that.
Yeah, there is. There's a structure that needs to end there, but there's the play of that with the kind of the pull of syntax, right? The pull of completion of a thought or of a phrase, and it's that kind of counterpoint between the two that makes it interesting. So, yeah, how do we account for that in computation? How can we further break a tool to do that? So, yes.
Yeah, I'm still formulating this question, but knowing that you have these two worlds that you operate in, which may not necessarily be your own. How then, what kind of traditional, for lack of a better word, Englishy question might you ask and answer with just an example of what you gave?
Sure.
Can you
So
translate into the other world that you also inhabit?
that's a tough question. In this case, the world it would translate into most without very much transformation is close reading, right? Like the idea of finding this small passage and circling outwards from the ambiguities in it to some interpretation of a larger piece of it. And that's what I was drawn to when I was conceiving of this method. But if the parameter is otherwise, if it's not syntax, if it's, say, density of a certain phoneme, right? If we think of this much more phonically, much more as poetry, as the texture of the language, that might lead us, I think, to other subfields. But the idea is to use the computer to push me towards those subfields in ways that I, with my limited capacity, often am too tired to do by the time I read a whole text. So.
Well, I was actually thinking, I don't know if you know of William Empson's 7 types of ambiguity,
Yes,
right? So I was thinking that this is actually like an extremely old-fashioned
Yes.
question in a way, because Empson argues in that book, which you probably know,
Yes.
that great literature derives its greatness from ambiguity.
Sure.
Basically, that the more complex and more valent a text is, the more we find to interest ourselves in it. So that, in a way, and there have been decades and decades of critical
Sure.
theory after that. But so in a way, it's returning to, it seems like it's kind of returning
Absolutely.
to that kind of premise, to say,
I think these things
let's
are
find
pendulums,
points
right?
at which
Yeah.
the syntax is ambiguous.
But in ways more complete than we could before, right? Or in ways more systematic, at least, than we could before. So, yes.
I mean, I'm interested in that, both the word complete and the word systematic in
Yeah.
relation to this. And one of the things that I'm wondering is that, given that a human being, given Empson, in which the kinds of ambiguity become more and more complicated, and
Yes.
more and more dense and difficult as he goes through that book, and then given that that the program is human created and human made, one of the things that I'm wondering about is the extent to which the use of the tool might actually foreclose
Sure.
an openness and a constant attentiveness
Yeah.
to different kinds of ambiguity that might be present that the programmer hasn't yet anticipated.
And the wonderful thing about these big data methods is that to put it bluntly, you can't lay it all on the programmer, right? So most of the logic which is used to categorize these words is not based on a hardwired algorithm, but rather on training over a corpus of actual language in a large one, right? So the idea is that I'm not hard encoding. If this word comes after this one, it's most likely a verb, but rather that I'm taking, in this case, it's actually a poor match. So the corpus that I trained this with is mostly 20th century, right?
We're still only looking for certain kinds of ambiguity.
Oh yeah, certainly, yeah. And yeah, I wouldn't pretend that this would do anything with word sense, for instance, right? This is just purely syntactic ambiguity and in chains of 4 words or fewer. So I think there's much work to be done outside of that. The trade-off is that because it's kicking you back into the text immediately to find these passages, that then you turn on your human critical brain, the one that can find the other 6 types of ambiguity, let's say, and you can do interesting critical work in places you might not have found before. As a side note, you should all read William Empson on Faustus, actually. Faustus and the Censor. It's a posthumous book and a crazy one in which he hypothesizes a kind of a censor and revision of the text in order to make it what it is, and instead he has Faustus escaping as a middle spirit. It's a bizarre book, but as all of Emerson's writing is, I think, kind of wonderfully provocative too. So, any other questions? Great, thank you.